Next up, we are moving on to a fireside chat that is with Christine Spang, who's the CTO and co-founder of Nylas, and your moderator is Steve Pereira, who is the founder at Visible Value Stream Consulting, and they are going to be chatting about architecting engineering organizations for high growth and scale.
Hi, folks. So I'm Steve Pereira. I'll be moderating the session today. I had a great intro, so I can just throw to Christine, CTO and co-founder of Nylas. Let's dive right into this. First thing that I noticed when I started learning about you and your career and your background, I noticed that your homepage is a wiki, which I thought was wonderful. Does that tell us anything about you? Is there anything in that is an indicator of your personality or your history?
Yeah, definitely. It's kind of funny. I think you're the only person who has ever brought this up. So it was a cool question to get. But yeah, I think there's a few things that this sort of belies about myself. One is that it's not only a wiki, but it's also a very minimalist wiki written in Perl that stores its pages and history in a version control system such as Git. And it compiles those pages into static HTML pages, so it's super lightweight to load and fast in the browser. And the reason I ended up using this software is because I actually got into software engineering through free and open source software, and actually this Linux distribution called Debian. And I was pretty close with the community around there, and this wiki software was created by one of the developers who was very involved in kind of Debian for quite a long time. So Perl was also the first dynamic programming language I really learned. I guess another thing that you can tell from my wiki is that the front page was last edited in the fall of 2013, which is right after I started Nylas. So don't start a company if you want to keep your homepage up to date.
That's a fantastic point to transition us into the main topic. And thanks for the background. I think that does say a lot about your enthusiasm for open source and technology, and how much experience you have with this. So if we're talking about Nylas and you're starting Nylas, what led you to start your own company? And tell us a little bit about what Nylas is about.
Yeah, for sure. I got into entrepreneurship through a pretty roundabout path. So I mentioned previously that I was really into Linux and open source software, and so I went to university at MIT, and basically, I got quite involved in this computer club at MIT, and my interest in Linux and operating systems ended up with me working at basically a small Linux security startup that was a spin-off from this club. The founders were, like officers in the club, and I knew them through that. And so I've been helping one of those founders upload some math software to Debian, and ended up working part-time for them during my senior year. And so, basically my background in sort of open source led me to discover startups. So I was with that company for about 3 years and kind of saw the whole life cycle of a startup. They ended up selling the company to Oracle for a modestly successful outcome. And then basically sort of once I'd been there long enough to kind of make sure that we had a good team in place to keep the technology going at Oracle, I started thinking about what I was going to do next. And Nylas really ended up coming out of MIT as well. Kind of towards the end of my time at Ksplice, which was that little company, I reconnected with an old friend who I also knew through MIT, and he'd been trying to build a tool that essentially connected data from email to data from the MIT student directory as basically his senior thesis project. And that's where the kind of spark of the idea came from, because he just had a really hard time with getting this to work, because it was a lot more complicated to do things that seemed like they should be really simple when it came to actually accessing and displaying data from a mailbox. So that was kind of the original spark to Nylas. And I think a common path for successful startups is that, essentially you start with like a really sort of narrow and specific problem to solve. And so in our case, it was, we want to make it easier to develop software that can connect to the data in email. And then, once you, launch and you start getting into like a feedback loop with your customers and sort of, looking around and seeing how the technology environment is evolving over time, like, what you're able to do and the vision of the company can very naturally expand. So, we started out with email, and then as a part of talking to our customers, early adopters, we ended up, realizing that, folks didn't want to just, access that data in email and, automate workflows around that. But there's a very natural overlap with scheduling and calendars and also address book access. So we started kind of adding these like additional channels over time. And then, today, like we really see ourselves as building, shipping and building blocks for other people to essentially embed human interaction into other software. Most of that is for kind of like business and productivity use cases. So we like to call it productivity infrastructure, which is kind of like APIs for, building tools that make people more productive.
That's an awesome overview. I just want to check in real quick. Like my video went kind of weird. Does yours look normal or expected?
Mine is looking a little strange too. I noticed that, but the audio seems to still be working properly.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect. So we'll keep it rolling. I just wanted to check and make sure that I wasn't the only one seeing something strange. But audio is fine and it's working. Box. I can hear you. Yeah, me too. Yeah. All right. We're not unfamiliar with black boxes, I'm sure. So we can keep going.
The black.
So right. So as you scaled Nylas and, encountered these new opportunities and, sort of grew to meet the demands of your customers, what are the kind of takeaways and lessons that you have learned as you kind of faced all these different challenges or questions in the evolution process?
Definitely. It looks like we're back with the video. That's nice. Cool. There's obviously a lot of different aspects to scaling. So there's different ways in which I could dive into this, but I think it would help to just give a little bit of context around just like what Nylas has been through. So I've been running the company for a bit over 7 years at this point, and the first few years were very much kind of like just like searching for product market fit. It took us a few years of trying different directions. We built a couple products that didn't go anywhere, and then we sort of came back to our roots really with the API infrastructure. And so I think like, and today we're kind of in like the growth phase. So, we have a product that works and we're scaling it up to, like similar use cases, but also kind of expanding the use cases that people use Nylas for with the same kind of core technology base. So, from the technology side, like for almost every company out there, when you're tiny and you don't know what the product should be, you really should be optimizing for, developer productivity and fast iteration. So that means like using like a really high level programming language. And this is like, unless you're building like a database or something like that, that's like very, very like performance sensitive infrastructure. So, we started out actually as being like a 100% Python shop for probably the first, 5 years of the company's history. And you always will like cut a few corners in the beginning because it's more important to figure out like, does it work and do people want this? Then, is the technology like perfect and 100% scalable? So the tech debt does start catching up to you after a while. I would say that like 4 years is kind of the threshold that I feel like was, impactful for us, where like suddenly you're like, we need to make some more foundational investments so that we can keep moving with velocity. And then, I think there's, a few other things to kind of keep in mind. Like, one is that, most of the time it's faster and more effective for you to make incremental changes and improvements to the product. But there may be times when, if the company takes off, and certainly this has been the case for us, that you need to sort of create like a side track where you start thinking about, what are like some foundational things that we can do to make this more, just fully more scalable, and sort of revisit some of the core assumptions that you made up front. Like, for example, for us, we made some assumptions up front about sort of like data storage and like access to historical data and how important that was. And that was like a huge scaling constraint for us, just of like how data intensive it's been to scale our infrastructure. And so, in the past year or so, we've started revisiting some of those fundamental assumptions and kind of created a cross-functional team to try some increments. And like, you keep making incremental improvements to like the core product while you're, off and trying to figure out, whether there's things that you can do that will, make things 10 times better, and, work with the product team to figure out, what have you learned about the product and the needs of the customers over some measures that, might be assumption that can be changed and questioned. So, I think that's something that's really stood out to me. I have a rule of thumb, which is that every time you scale your infrastructure 10x, something is going to fall over. And it may or may not be something that you predict. Obviously, like, you want to have a good sort of theoretical understanding of the limitations of your architecture. But, sometimes it's like the cache server for like some specific feature that I necessarily think about. And so I think like as a company and product gets more mature and the growth gets a little more predictable, you can start doing things more proactively. Like when you first launch a product, it's like you don't have any historical data to know, how fast you're going to grow. And the best thing early on is to kind of like, have some metrics and relate from there, and use that for planning. But I found that going into the growth stage, it's more and more important to have like a really good communication channel with, for example, the sales and customer success teams down back to engineering. Because they have leading information about like your scaling needs, and even though we found that most of the time customers, at least in our space, will overestimate how fast they're going to grow, like it's still useful information to plan around. And I think that one thing that becomes possible once you're kind of in the more kind of steady high growth stage is having basically, you're doing more customer onboarding, and it's possible to, time things more accurately.
Yeah, you mentioned stages and these kind of like maturity levels. And one of the ones that is pretty major in a startup's life is when you start to tackle the enterprise, if you are B2B and that's on your horizon. So what are some questions that are really important to ask, or the questions that sort of arose for you as you started to tackle that kind of enterprise scale or more mature customer segment?
Yeah, I think there's a few major constraints and sort of things that we thought about and looked at. The first one was security, really. Like, are we security ready to handle the needs of much more mature organizations with more strict requirements? So that was something that we started investing in a number of years ago. And there's pretty standard security certifications that if you start selling to enterprise customers, they just expect that you will have it, and it's a hurdle that you will have to clear in order to even get through, the first parts of the sales process. So that's a big one. Is like, is my organizational structure and processes like mature enough to adhere to these sort of security audits and guidelines? Because it's not just a thing you do once. You're literally certifying that, like, through the entire year, we're doing things that comply with what's specified here in this standard. So you need to have an amount of structure to be able to do that. And in some cases, like, you're going to have to hire out dedicated security folks. So that's a big one. I think that, like, just another thing is, enterprise customers expect more from a vendor that they're working with in terms of support. So, for example, we invested in creating a dedicated customer success organization, which is parallel to and related to, but not fully a part of our just general support org, where they're doing more proactive. They do onboarding. Now they have an onboarding program for new enterprise customers, and help them through the integration, do the project management, work up to launch, make sure that they're following best practices and are going to be successful. So I think that's something that's really key to have as you move into the enterprise market, because people are just, they expect more in terms of support. So if you don't give that to them, they're not going to be successful. But on the bright side, larger companies have a lot more predictability. They will pay more upfront for your product. And then, I think, a lot of these deals end up being very large, so they can be a very meaningful amount of revenue for your company. And they can give you the stability that you need to make those investments in the product and scaling. I guess another thing that, sort of is good to keep in mind is that, larger companies will expect economies of scale in their pricing. Everybody expects that, if I buy 1 million of such and such unit, it's going to cost a lot less than if I bought 1,000 of that thing. So another question to ask is, like, can we guarantee, nonlinear scaling in your own costs in order to be able to service those kinds of contracts? So yeah, I think there's, like, when you say scaling to a tech person, a lot of time the first thing you think of is, like, is it possible for this architecture, this software to serve, 10 or the number of requests that I'm getting right now, or the volume of data, or whatever the kind of technical metric is. But, when you're thinking of scaling in terms of, like, an organization and, like, a technology product, there's other aspects, both, the sort of nonlinear costs, where you need to be able to make sure that, you're going to be able to continue to make a good margin, and not be sort of funding your enterprise customers, production with your own money. And then there's kind of this pillar that I would call, like, supportability, because, at a certain point, you can fill in gaps in technology with people, but that doesn't scale. Like, the whole point of technology is to give leverage to people. And so you want to make sure that, the amount of errors that are happening, and the amount of times that people reach out to your own support team to fix things or to ask questions and things like that is something that, your enterprise level customer is going to be able to, like, look at and say, yeah, we can onboard, this huge amount of clients to this, or, our own workload, and it's going to be something that's manageable.
Yeah, that's great breadth as well as depth, I think, on many fronts. Just wrapping up now, I think we've got just a little bit left. Is there any final thoughts that you want to share about scaling that's on your mind, or something that you want to share with the audience?
Yeah, I mean, I think that like one of the most fun things about scaling is that if you have scaling problems at all, it means that somebody wants your product, and you have in some ways already become successful. So one thing that I always tell myself is that like, these are good problems to have, and like I'd rather be to solve scaling up than making sure that we're building something that people actually want in the first place. So it's a good place to be.
Absolutely. That's a great way to end on a positive note. I love it. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and your experience. And it's been a pleasure talking to you.